Welcome everyone to the last Fireside session of the last Node by Slush event of the year, aka the grand finale. My name is Elmo, and I'm from the product team here at Slush. What a session we have coming up. Our guest star today is Andrew Chen, a general partner at Andreessen Horowitz. Today, Andrew will share his 5 learnings on succeeding in consumer tech. Our moderator today will be Lenny Rachitsky. Lenny writes a popular newsletter about product, growth, and working with humans. I love the newsletter, by the way. Lenny also angel invests and advises startups. Previously, Lenny spent 7 years at Airbnb leading initiatives around growth, quality, and community. Before that, Lenny was a founder and an engineer. The runtime of this session will be 45 minutes. The fireside will be 25 minutes, and after that, Andrew and Lenny will be taking questions from the audience. Make sure to use the Q&A feature to ask your questions. This way, Lenny will have an easier time spotting those. You can share the best insights from this session in Twitter with the hashtag #NodeBySlush. Finally, the session is live streamed on YouTube, so if you have any friends who would like to join, feel free to invite them as well. I'll shut up now so you can enjoy this session. Lenny, take it away.
Hello, slushers. I am super honored to be sitting down with the one and only Andrew Chen, who I imagine everybody here knows, but for everybody else that doesn't, Andrew is a general partner at Andreessen Horowitz, where he invests in consumer startups and marketplaces and social and gaming and entertainment platforms. And he sits on the boards of HipCamp and Substack and SnackPass and Lunch Club and Virtual Kitchens and Sleeper and a few other companies. And prior to Andreessen Horowitz, he led various growth teams at Uber and other companies through their hyper growth. And the way that I got to know Andrew and the way that I think many of you got to know Andrew is through his writing. He's a prolific writer. He's written hundreds of blog posts around network effects and metrics and a lot of other things. And on that, his latest project is actually he's writing a book, which I'm very excited about, that's coming out next year, published through Harper Business, that I'm very excited to read. And so maybe without further ado, welcome, Andrew.
All right, thank you, Lenny. And of course, like we're now like newsletter pals and read each other's stuff. And so, Lenny, your writing is amazing, and I'm such a fan as well.
Thanks, Andrew. You paved the way for my newsletter life. And so maybe on that topic, maybe the first question. You kind of were one of the inventors and popularizers of this term of growth hacking and the fact that it's replacing marketing. And it's kind of become this loaded term now. And I'm curious how you think about how founders should think about balancing long-term growth versus short-term growth.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so both Lenny and myself were on growth teams of our various companies, and it's interesting to see that and how that's evolved over many years, which is it's all about teams, it's all about building systems of growth, it's all about building repeatability, versus I think there's a lot that over the last 6 or 7 years, I think the term like growth hacks has somehow turned into thinking about like turn this button orange and like it'll increase conversions by 10%. It's sort of meant to be like all these like little tricks that people do. But I think in the world that that Lenny and I are from, from an operating standpoint, what ends up happening is what you're really going after is you're really thinking about growth not as like a feature of marketing, like, oh, just to go buy more ads and go do this and go do that. But instead, what you're doing is you're really thinking about like building a system, building a loop that is how your company actually grows in a very repeatable way, in a very scalable way. And so, for example, I'll just name a couple of the loops that are really common. In the world of like, LinkedIn, for instance, it's like they're trying to get you to, you're often finding a particular user, or you're being invited into the product. They're grabbing your address book, you're inviting other people. Those people then accept their invites, and then that sort of continues. That's a viral loop. You might have like a UGC. User-generated content SEO loop. That's like kind of like what Yelp does, where you come in and you fill out, you Google for something, you fill out content, you find a listing that you want. Some percentage of those people become content creators. and off you go. That's how Wikipedia grows. That's how a lot of the Reddit and some of these other kind of SEO driven things grow. And so what ends up happening is like, why is it that actually a bunch of these companies have dozens of people working on their growth teams? I think at the peak, Uber had like almost 500 people working on the growth team. And the reason is because it just takes so much effort and time and thinking and analytics and all that other stuff in order to actually think about all these loops and then to optimize them. And so I think that's kind of like, I think where the industry has kind of moved is after kind of the initial growth hacking is the new VP marketing kind of point of view, that it's now today much more about these repeatable cycles. And so I think every startup needs to sort of navigate from non-scalable kind of one-off things just to get kind of solve the cold start problem and kind of move it along, but then ultimately get to the scalable state. And that's why all these companies like have pointed these resources at them.
It sounds like the takeaway is both. You need to do short-term growth and figure out this long-term growth loop. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, just like anything, you need to know the tactics as well as kind of how all the strategic bits fit together. But I think because of the internet, because of like Twitter, like the content marketing that works is like, here's how you increase conversions by like 20. There's sort of like the get rich quick schemes. But for the startup version, where everyone wants to kind of like grow things quickly without putting too much work into it. And I think, you end up needing to know the whole tactical playbook as well as, how it all fits together.
Wish there was a much simpler path, but startups are hard.
Everything is hard, right?
everything that's worth it is hard.
Yes.
So maybe building on that, a lot of founders are discovering that distribution is often as important, maybe sometimes more important than the product. And so are you seeing anything new or creative ways to think about new distribution channels today that founders should be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, just to build on kind of the first part of your point, if you go back and look at consumer tech companies in like the 1990s and the original dot-com bubble, like actually building like websites was like really hard back then. Like we didn't have like, all the open source, we didn't have like AWS, we didn't have any of these things. And so the engineering piece and the technical kind of defensibility of even consumer products was like a thing, like that was a thing. But then what ended up happening was, after all those trends that we talked about, you quickly get to a point where actually the technology is not the thing. Like almost all of these products, whether it's Snapchat and Twitter and all these marketplace companies and et cetera, like writing the code and building the product is like at least the initial version, maybe not all the corner cases and all the bells and whistles, but at least the initial version ends up being actually like relatively easy. And what ends up happening, the part that's hard, Lenny, to your point, is basically, well, what's your hypothesis on like going to market and getting, in the case of consumer products, millions of users? Like that's the part that's actually really, really hard, not the technology. And so I think there's a very interesting flip, of kind of the difficulty in the, early 2000s that sort of, drove this. And so now today, I think, the way that, at least the way that I evaluate a lot of, consumer startups is it's not that important for, a startup to, in their deck to talk about what cool brand new technology they're using. I mean, it's great when there is some, but I do really care about, their growth strategy as almost as much as I care about their product. And ideally, their product kind of has like growth kind of built in. There's sort of this naturally, viral, piece to it. I know we're going to talk about, the creator economy and influencers and all that as an example. And also, I can talk about video, et cetera. But I think what's happened in the last decade is, we had the Facebook platform for a while. We had the mobile, the mobile platforms, Google Play and the App Store. And then there's been this narrative, I think, within the consumer startups industry, which is basically like consumer startups are, dead. Like we should just stop working on them. It's like too hard to build. It's too hard to grow. And then I think one of the really interesting parts of all of this is, certainly in the last year, given everything that's been, going on because of shelter in place and COVID and everything, there are a number of, I think, huge new opportunities from a growth standpoint that I want to, sort of list out. So I think, the first one I would say would be first, what we're doing right now, video, right? Like everything offline that that folks were doing offline is now fully switched to online, virtualized, on video. And so I think there's a tremendous number of really interesting opportunities along the signs of, whether that's like training and coaching and education and dating, and the list goes on. We can make a list of like 20 different things. Those are all things where now there's going to be startup attempts for each one of these. And all of that video content that's being created and recorded, because everyone in as a consumer is being taught this behavior, is now can actually be syndicated and built and spread on all of the video platforms, whether that's YouTube or Twitch or all the various stories platforms, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that whole thing is like super, super interesting. The second thing, of course, is which was already a huge trend, but I think even spreading even faster now is all of these workplace collaboration tools. For a long time, everybody who had experience building consumer internet products, got so smart about how to use, how to build viral loops, how to use address books, how invite systems work, how all of that, how all these interlocking, growth things happen, and A/B testing and all of that other stuff. And the interesting part was you go to the enterprise, and it was like basically bad products that weren't built with the consumer, in mind. Like kind of true like enterprise, we're talking like Oracle and SAP and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden we're seeing this generation of really great consumer grade products. Not only the product experience is amazing, but then, these are products that can plug into the calendar. They can plug into, the G Suite. They have access to your workplace, address books. They can plug into Slack. They can plug into all of these other things. And then, you kind of get all this fresh snow in terms of, distribution in all the ways that are there. And then to briefly summarize, a lot of what's been going on with influencers is that, we're having, it's an unprecedented time economically for people, all over the world because of COVID. There's, a lot of folks that are in especially, sort of hourly worker, jobs that would have worked in restaurants, would have worked retail, that aren't available. And so there's a huge amount of interest for people to find new income streams. And so, in the past, that would have been the gig economy, and some of that is certainly, going strong. And then I think the other thing that's been really interesting is if you virtualize everything and you put everything on video, you do, all of these, like the whole trend basically moves people towards finding new kinds of work. And so, I think that's a super interesting one, because obviously, as we're seeing with Substack and with Patreon and with Shopify and with OnlyFans and with all of these, different services that are out there, you're seeing that like there's new ways to be entrepreneurs on the internet. And so, and that obviously is really built on like ultimately social media to spread and using all of these tools to go about it.
Wow, that was a knowledge bomb. So much knowledge to consume. So maybe on that last point you just made there around Substack and newsletters, Substack's kind of this like hot startup and kind of startup of the moment right now. And I'm curious what you think made it successful and different. The fact that, newsletters have been around for a long time. You had a newsletter 10 years ago. Is there anything interesting that they've done or some insight that they've had or that I think helped them become what they are?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think the biggest thing about Substack as an idea, and then we can talk about some of the other kind of timing and team and so on. But Substack is an amazing phenomenon. Like if you go to Twitter and you just search for Substack and you look at kind of the most recent, I mean, it's amazing how often people are talking about, how much people are talking about it. It's like a really interesting company and one that I got involved with a couple of years ago because actually Hamish, who's one of the co-founders, pitched me to use Substack. So that's how I ended up actually getting to know the team. But I think there's a couple things in there, right? So if you think about what the gig economy actually is, and you think about what marketplaces generally are, they're usually about kind of the utilization of kind of underutilized assets, right? So Uber is about underutilized cars and what are different ways that we can utilize that. Airbnb ends up being about underutilized space, like in your house or having a vacation home. Even if you can think about eBay and OpenTable and ClassPass and things like that, also kind of in the same vein. These are sort of like, there's open slots in your class that you can fill, et cetera. I think what's really interesting about a term that A16Z has been writing about, which is the passion economy, is instead of underutilized assets, we're actually talking about underutilized talent, right? And underutilized skills, which is like a very interesting way to think about it, which is that if you were the very, very best, opera singer in 10,000 years ago in your town of 500 people, like there isn't really that big of a market, even if you were like the top, most amazing person. But what the internet's done is basically to be able to say, okay, actually, we're now one global market. And in fact, if you're like the most esoteric, weird, thing, I know Lenny and I like to joke a little bit about us being B2B influencers in extremely niche topics. That's like kind of been our superpower. It turns out that like there is an audience for that, because like that audience is all about, this huge global audience, that's able to do that. And so, so if you were to basically like kind of take the strong form of this idea, you basically say, well, what that means is anybody in the world with any kind of like amazing talent, right? You have to actually be good, like, but some kind of underutilized talent. It turns out there's a market for what you do, and not only is there a market for what you do, there's sort of like the idea of 1,000 true fans, where you just need 1,000 people giving you $10 a month, and like that's it. But it's like actually, my former colleague Lee Jin talked about this. There's the concept of 100 true fans, where you just need people to give you $100 a month. And like, again, with a larger and larger market, that's kind of where you go. So anyway, let me bring this back to Substack. So I think what's happened with Substack is it's turned out that like, actually there's a lot of great writers out there, and there's a lot of latent supply of writers, where there's folks that write about climate change, or they just write, they're really funny, or they're really astute, about politics or about sports or whatever. And back in the day, that was just like your maybe fun friend that like knew a lot about like this nerdy topic. And then it turns out that you can now take that, amazing skill and convert it into something that you can, market yourself. And so it's been fantastic to see, professors that maybe normally would have been teaching, hundreds of students over their lifetime be able to actually just start writing newsletters, and then now make significantly more. There's now folks that are making over $1 million a year in subscriptions, and so I think that's an amazing thing, and it's a trend that I think is gonna continue. And so writing happens to be one underutilized talent, but then I think there are many other ones. And I think ultimately, what Substack's really built on is the idea that because we have this latent supply of writers, and we have this latent demand for all of these different topics, that in a time where the media companies are hurting and laying off writers, at a time where people are reading fewer and fewer books, et cetera, that this is this amazing growth opportunity that is making this market a lot more efficient. And so anyway, so it's a super interesting company. Chris and Hamish and Jay Raj, they're amazing guys. They previously had started Kick, and they went through YC, and they're fantastic guys. And so anyway, so it's a very cool company.
I think the second, someone in the top ranks of Substack, I think she's in like the 7 figures, and she does it as a part-time gig, is my understanding. And it's like $5 a user. And she just has enough users where it's like a massive income. Yeah.
I mean, eventually you have to wonder, like, that's a pretty good, like, should that a part-time gig that maybe should be full-time?
Yep. Yeah, should make. I don't know.
I thought, like, we've talked about this, that after spending a bunch of time writing my book, it's been like 2.5 years. I'm like, maybe I should have just made this like a big Substack and just published it bit by bit. That might have actually been a better ROI. But anyway, so
that's
I'm
my strategy.
Now, so.
That's my strategy. And I think what's interesting,
you are writing a book, actually, just one newsletter at a time. Exactly.
And just on this quick topic, I think there's kind of 2 routes with newsletter career. There's like charge for it and make money directly, and then there's do it free and then leverage that to get something else. And so I'm kind of going like, I'm just going to monetize it directly. I think in your case and a lot of other people's cases, it's use it to grow a big audience and then use that to get other things that maybe are even more valuable.
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
So, so you touched on this, on the kind of this gig economy that used to be maybe the the core, I don't know, some of the more interesting companies over the last 10 years came out of what we call the gig economy. And maybe you already touched on this, but do you have a sense of where things are going now? Is it like the passion economy? Is it marketplaces? Is it something else? How do you see that?
Kind of, yeah. Where does all that go? Yeah, it's an interesting one because I think so. Just to expand on kind of the gig economy versus the passion economy and kind of how I think about the two of them. So I think like the gig economy and then marketplaces more generally, I think are going to obviously continue, and there will be great, amazing companies within all of that, and so I think that'll be great. But the goal of those marketplaces is so different, right? Like the goal of an Uber where I worked was to basically take a complicated job that you previously had to be licensed for. And basically, how do you split it into the smallest possible pieces and automate it all with software such that you could basically make the broadest, most sort of atomic work unit possible so that anybody could do it, right? And there is something really amazing about that and that's why like Uber has millions and millions of drivers that are able to do the work, and you really don't need to be that skilled in order to do it. You just need a driver's license and like off you go. And I think that will kind of continue, and we'll find more jobs that actually can be split and made into little pieces. I think on the flip side, I think what we also see is that there's a lot of knowledge work out there that does not look like that at all. There's some knowledge work that maybe looks like that, right? I mean, maybe, and we could speculate on what kinds, but, maybe like a lot of like kind of back office, like accounting kind of stuff, maybe looks like that, and, and should kind of follow a little bit like the gig economy kind of, point of view. But there's another set of, work out there that basically is much more about differentiation. It's much more about people building their own audiences. It's the exact opposite. You're not trying to commoditize the work unit. You're actually trying to, every work unit is completely, different. Like Lenny, your work on Substack is very, very different than someone else's writing. And there's probably, like no one else really that's writing the same kind of stuff as you. Like that's kind of like what's amazing about it. And so I think when you look at that for writing, I think that will also exist ultimately for people that make different kinds of video, that make different kinds of music, that make different kinds of, kind of different forms of knowledge work, coaching and training, and we can kind of go on and on. But, I think this is a little bit like the split of the kinds of work that are actually out there in the world and the way that software actually is meant to sort of, overlay on top of it. And so I don't think that there will ever be a Uber for writing. Like that doesn't make any sense, right? And so I think instead, I think naturally like that doesn't make any sense. And so instead, what you actually want is you want something that is all about, kind of diversity and depth and consumer choice and all this other stuff. And because it's a very different kind of work, I think there will be a very different type of approach. And the current approach that I think has worked has been one where, Lenny, to your point, you basically end up with creators that build very, very large top of funnels. And they build huge top of funnels in social media, and they have lots of Twitter followers. They have huge email, mailing lists. And then they basically take all of the support that they've created in the ecosystem. And then they figure out like, okay, what are like 5 different things I could potentially sell into the same audience? And so I think there's going to be a lot of really interesting experimentation over the next couple of years on this.
I'm excited for that. Let me kind of go in a different direction, and then we're going to have Q&A for the last 15 minutes. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box, wherever that is. And I want to talk about influencers briefly. It feels like influencers are becoming a new distribution channel, and I'd love to hear your advice on how founders should work with influencers.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things, kind of touching on the earlier point we made around repeatable growth versus kind of one-off growth. And so let me talk about the repeatable stuff, and then we'll talk about kind of the one-off stuff. So not every kind of creator influencer startup is the same, right? Like the one that you want, the one that's like kind of, the most powerful, like kind of growth loop that you can possibly build is one where, where the creators and the influencers, they basically want to promote your product or your platform as part of their core business, and they're willing to visibly put it, and it's their main business, and so they're constantly promoting you. And so what ends up happening is you're able to create a growth loop that is this sort of, this creator, kind of growth loop where, someone uses your product, they put it in their bio, they put it in their Twitter bio, they put it in their Instagram bio, they post about it, they tweet about it. You end up with a set of people who then show up and they're the customers. And some percentage of those are actually also influencers themselves or creators themselves. And they end up also using the product, right? And similarly, so that's maybe one loop that's going. And then the other loop that's going is maybe like a creator to creator, like referral program, or, we could come up with like a couple different loops, for something like this abstractly. But I think the point of all of this is that, that being really in this highly visible state, that's the thing that actually really powers ultimately the Shopify's and Patreons and Substacks, of the world. I think there's also a lot of folks that are kind of building, that are in kind of ancillary parts of the, like the creator ecosystem. But they might look a little bit more B2B. Maybe it's just sales. Maybe it's just content marketing, right? And those are fine, but I think those are like less explosive because they're not really hooked into that core flywheel. So I think that's ideally what the type of business that you're doing and how you can hook into that. And then I think what's interesting is how you even get it bootstrapped and started. So one of the things that Andreessen Horowitz that we've been doing is through both the Cultural Leadership Fund, which is an amazing thing that's run by Chris Lyons and counts as LPs some of the most interesting folks entertainment and media and sports and business, et cetera, as well as the market development team. We actually have been talking to a lot of the the various agencies and directly with the creators themselves. And I think one of the things that you have to figure out is like, well, if you want to bootstrap this thing and you're working, you're in a world right now where they're very excited to work with tech, but the reality is the power law curve is very, very steep. And and the very top folks, if you take Ninja as a streamer and then you go down 10 slots, it falls off very, very fast. And so I think what's happened is there's a lot of folks that are playing around more with brand, but I don't actually know that the right way to do it is to get, work with agencies, who then kind of, they want to take a VIG, and then the creators themselves want some equity. They want to be paid for it. Like, I don't actually know that that's the right way, to go to market with folks. So I think the one that's the best is I think ultimately one where you're building something that's so valuable and so interesting that folks are organically, using it. And then you're able to ultimately scale with this kind of like growth loop that we've been talking about.
So as a last question before we get into Q&A, and there's a bunch of great questions coming in.
Awesome.
Feels like you talked about this a bit, but it feels like social and consumer apps are exploding, and there's kind of this renaissance of consumer and social. And I'm curious just to hear what you think, where things are going and what you think is going to be successful and what you're excited about.
Yeah, we talked about video for a little bit, and so let me expand on that, and then we should definitely talk about audio because I think that's also a good one, and maybe if we have time we'll talk about games for a little bit too. But I think I think for a long time we thought of video as like, oh, there's going to be a video, like social video, and like that's YouTube, and like that's it, and it was sort of almost viewed as a technical format, right? I think the interesting part has been actually, it's amazing to me that video, you can actually, have a clip and that's a YouTube clip and you can build a whole social site around that. And that's, and that's YouTube. And then by the way, like stories is its own like separate different context, even though it's all technically video. And then by the way, like, these like, TikTok dance, videos with music in the background, like, even though again, that's video and theoretically like YouTube should just own that, like you can build a whole company around that as well. And on and on and on. Like, I find that to be, extremely fascinating that even with the same underlying format, that you can build all these social products with different contexts around it. And so I think, I think, and when you go to that, what you end up finding out is ultimately, by having all of these technology changes, broadband, having, everyone with a supercomputer with a camera in our pockets, et cetera, that's what's kind of unleashing this, this whole video thing. And so I think we're going to see a lot more. And, we already talked about all the things that could go to video over time. Audio is one of the ones that we're also spending a ton of, time thinking about. And the reason for that is ultimately, there's been over 100 million units of those little white things that you're wearing, Lenny, in your ears, the AirPods. And that's amazing. And then there's been, also 100 million Alexa devices that have been sold, and now audio is getting built into all the cars and all the fridges and all the microwaves. Whether I want it or not, it's happening, right? And so I think the other really interesting thing is, I think a lot of folks think of audio as a subset of video, but it actually turns out that audio is something else entirely. Audio is something that occupies all the white space between, the times where you're actually looking at your phone, right? You can kind of leave it in the background. There's all this, stuff that's happening. And so, we've obviously seen the emergence of companies like Clubhouse that are, going after this. But I think, similar to video, it's actually going to be a thing where there's going to be a Clubhouse format of audio, and there's going to be many, many other kinds, Clubhouse is in particular a kind of, public follow graph with a, and it's all live streamed. I think we're also going to see, asynchronous versions that go beyond what podcasting, provide. There's going to be short versions, there's going to be long versions, there's going to be all sorts of stuff. And so I'm very excited about that. And we've been tracking that for a long time. And podcasts, of course, have been up and to the right for quite a while. Spotify is making very interesting moves in the space. And then the final thing I'll mention, Lenny, before we go to Q&A is the A16Z teams also made a huge effort into the game sector. And a lot of the reason for that is because we kind of have this belief that effectively every generation has its own, social network. This generation, like kind of the millennial generation ends up having a, much more about Instagram. Before that, maybe was much more about Facebook. And then you can go all the way back and say, oh yeah, there was this time where everyone was just like AOL Instant Messenger and Zanga and LiveJournal, and that was the thing. And then before that, there was everyone was on BBSs and, Usenet, and that was the thing. And you can kind of keep going back. And I think one of the really interesting parts is if every generation has its own social network, well, what's happening with everybody that's 8 years old right now, and what's the social experience that they have? And what they have is Roblox, and what they have is Minecraft, and what they have is is Fortnite. And they're spending all their time asynchronously with their friends, in this amazing 3D immersive environment. And by the time that they're allowed to have social media profiles, I'm very interested to see whether or not a two-dimensional scrolling feed of text, is actually going to be that interesting to them relative to all the experiences that they've been having with their friends over the last, couple of years. And so anyway, so one of our, recent investments in Europe actually has been Mainframe, which is a big bet in the cloud gaming space. And these are the folks that built EVE Online, which is a huge MMO back in the day. And they're building a new cloud gaming MMO, and we're excited to be working with them. But, those are the kinds of things that, that we've been excited in consumer as well.
Well, I've never heard it described that way, about how gaming could become the new social network. And that's why it's such a big opportunity. So, wow. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, we could have a whole side conversation on games, but I think it's I'm waiting for the day that there is a billion MAU, billion DAU, games environment. And we won't call it that. It'll be, something else entirely. So anyway, I think that should be pretty exciting.
Okay, so let's get to some Q&A. So the top rated question, which I think you can see if you click your Q&A tab, is
okay.
Do you think mobile is getting too saturated, and where do you think the next platform shift is going?
Yeah, I mean, I think we addressed a bit of that. I think certainly there are a lot of things that have been tried over the last 10 years at this point. And so a lot of what, you have to ask yourself in any kind of an idea is why now? And I often see ideas where I'm kind of this is kind of like a 2011 idea, it's kind of like a thing that you would have seen at a Web 2.0 barbecue, and you come up with it, and you're let's prototype this, there's tagging, there's this, there's that. It's it's there's stale ideas. And so I think you have to figure out how to go above and beyond. And ultimately, some of the areas that I'm interested in, is not mobile, I think is too big of a bucket. I think it's much more well, if you're using mobile in order to, go after, collaboration tools in the enterprise, that's clearly a super hot space where a lot of stuff is happening. And same with a lot of the video, kind of virtualized offline things we talked about. And so I think, the next, platform, we kind of talked a little bit about this, I think is video is an interesting one. All the workplace stuff is interesting. Audio is super interesting. Games is super interesting. I think those are all different kinds of platforms.
So the next highest voted, and there's a battle happening between two questions. So I'll go with the one that's currently winning. Do you think the LTV of consumer apps is getting shorter because there's just so much out there and there's so many apps and so many things to try and people kind of leave sooner?
That's interesting. I don't know, Lenny, maybe you would know this. I don't think I've seen any data out there that actually says that LTVs are going down or anything like that.
I think it's more people are not trusting LTV because it's just like so long term versus payback period.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's true. That's certainly true. Yeah, I think like we mostly just talk about like payback period and basically can you get your cost of customer acquisition paid off in 6 to 12 months, typically. But I think, maybe kind of as an interesting point there is there's a lot out there, and is it hard to get exposed to the right user? I think I do want to make a point, which is, when mobile apps first came out, it's definitely true that, like, think about what mobile apps were competing with back in the day. It was like waiting in line, like sitting on the toilet, like, like you were competing against like actually boring things. And then today, what's definitely true is, in order for your mobile app to be effective, the baseline of what you're competing with is like Instagram and like TikTok and like Netflix and things like that. You are competing with some of the most amazing, engaging products in existence. So I do think the baseline is probably bigger, but I haven't seen any data that would argue that in any way.
Same. Okay, so the next question is: Do you see corporate podcasting as I don't know, a new trend, and do you see anything happening there?
Yeah, I think there have been a lot of so I think there's two ways that corporate podcasting could work. I think one is one where you have kind of like corporate produced, corporate sponsored content that is about sort of an area that you want to create thought leadership in. I definitely think that that's going to be more and more of a thing, and I think the reason for that is like probably the B2B conference like the conference industry is like changed forever, and it's not clear that it's ever going to come back. And so if you're going to do that, if you're going to look like this, they're going to be on Zoom, or what's going to happen is a lot of that huge amount of budget is going to get reallocated to digital efforts. And so I think that actually makes a ton of sense. I think the other part that is super interesting on kind of B2B podcasts would be kind of like what the Andreessen Horowitz like podcast is all about, right? It's like super interesting, super nerdy topics. It's built by a company. It's a way for a company to have a direct relationship with its ecosystem, as opposed to back in the day, it was all about, working with PR agencies and having the media tell your story. Instead, now it's much more about, blogging and, podcasting and all that stuff, and having the executives of your company also active on social media, et cetera, et cetera. And so, many of you may have read the recent thing about how Tesla has like fired its PR department. And it's just going to be, Elon on Twitter now. And so like, on one hand, like that's pretty extreme. On the other hand, it's like, there is some like, there is a grain of interestingness to that maybe more and more companies will move in that kind of direction.
What are the must-haves for a go-to-market strategy?
Yeah. It's a very general question. I guess what I would say is, and Lenny, feel free to chime in on this one. I would say that, before engaging somebody with a lot of, like high-end growth expertise, the big thing that I actually spend my time on is actually just validating product market fit and validating retention. And there's a lot of reasons why, one kind of has to precede the other. But some of the things I end up looking for is I end up looking at, retention curves. So for example, if it's a social product, I often look at D1, D7, D30 on the retention curve. I look for kind of 60, 30, 15% is sort of like a common, metric. I might look at, kind of monthly retention. I might look at, sort of how much engagement there is in other ways. I often look at, how much are people talking about something on Twitter, on Reddit, on Instagram. And then ultimately, like if you really believe that it's there, I mean, one of the advantages of being in kind of, either in Lenny's case where you're advising a lot of companies, or in our case where we see a lot of companies and we ask for a lot of data, is we actually have a fairly good sense of benchmarking, kind of where people are from a product market fit standpoint, because it's so easy to say, oh, our product is sticky, people love it. Like, most products have some kind of a segment of people who do love it. But really saying, no, this is like a 98th percentile retention curve. Like that is much, much harder to say. And so once we validate that, then I think the next part of the go-to-market is basically like, there is such a thing as mapping your product to the right set of growth strategies and channels. If you're a travel product, which is like people travel, twice a year. I mean, I guess people are not traveling right now. Maybe there's some local travel happening right now, but you're not gonna make that a daily use, like viral invite growing kind of a thing. Like that's what social daily, products do. And instead, what you need to focus on is you need to focus on SEO, you need to focus on SEM, you need to figure out, where is it going to be that there's going to be, actual end consumer intent that needs to happen that you need to capture at the right moment and, go from there. And that implies a certain set of growth channels. And then what ends up happening is you end up finding people who are good at growth in those particular channels. Like you can't get a product-driven growth person and throw them at a heavily like affiliate and, kind of like social media paid marketing kind of a job. Like that's just not how it works. And so I think once you craft all of that and you understand all of that, then you can finally go to market. Anyway, and then, I mean, this is like, you could have a 1 hour conversation on just like literally this thing, but I would say those are some of the foundations before you even want to get into, thinking about your strategy.
My quick rule of thumb, I'm writing a post about this, which is why it's top of mind for go-to-market.
Oh yeah, great.
Is first figure out who your audience is. It's basically who, what, where. Who is your target audience? Is it like a developer? Is it a founder? Is it a CFO? Then what's your value prop to them? That's really compelling and different. Like I think Dropbox's was like, throw away your thumb drive. And Robinhood was no fees. And then you figure out where these people are. Like, are they on Hacker News? Are they on Twitter? Are they at this conference? And then you present your value prop to them there. That's kind of how I think about it.
Right.
So I think we have time for a couple more questions. So upvote your questions if you want to make sure it gets asked. So the top current question is around referral programs, and just what are some features that you find are really important to a successful referral program? Yeah,
so at various points, I led the referral programs for the driver and rider side of Uber, and I think at the peak we were spending something like $300 or $400 million a year on referral credits. So like we had a very big operation and had ended up with a whole bunch of engineers and people that were actually just optimizing all of these referral programs. So I have lots of lessons, and so I'm going to try to just quickly remember them as we go. But this is like over a year of work. But yeah, so I think a couple of things on referrals. I think the first thing is when you ask for a referral, I think it ends up being actually very important. And the best place to ask actually is, in my experience, has been honestly the earlier the better. And the reason for that is if your cohort curve kind of like inevitably kind of slopes down pretty fast, what ends up happening is exposing the referral UI early on is you'll get more users, you'll get more performance out of it. I think there's sometimes a tendency to try to put it way in the back of a user's lifecycle. But the problem is, like, by then, you'll have much fewer people. You also end up in a state where once people have invited a couple of times, the product maybe gets a little bit stale. They're not as excited about it. So, so I think like moving it up front is also good. I've also heard of a framework that I think is a really good one, which is thinking about this as like kind of a happy moments, kind of spikes in NPS. If we think of Net Promoter Score as like one number for a product, it's like, I got a 70. It's like, okay, cool. But like the other way to think about it is it's actually a real-time graph. And as people are using your product, there's moments of delight where it really spikes up, right? And then it comes back down, and there's maybe moments where it's like low. And so one of the really interesting questions is, well, can you take your entire user lifecycle in the whole thing and find moments where you are very likely to have a, kind of like a happy moment where there is a spike, and then, is that the place where you want to do some kind of a prompt, for invites, right? I think that's very interesting. And then I think once you move on, beyond that, I would say, and sorry, maybe I'll give an example for that also, is like, for an e-commerce product, There might be the moment that you actually order something and then there's something where you know it's like on its way. That might be an interesting moment to share, like, oh, I have, I'm really happy about that. You might have a moment where you actually like get the product. You might get a moment where, you set it up, and it's working for the first time, and just really thinking about all of those points in your product. The other thing, that's interesting is like, well, what's the difference between a referral program and like an invite, kind of a thing. And basically what it comes down to is that invites are meant to be, mostly intrinsically motivated, right? So for example, a huge proportion, I think the majority of the way that Dropbox has grown over the years is just people sharing folders with each other, right? And that's awesome because that's the best quote unquote referral program. It's like, it's useful, it's utility. I'm sharing a folder with Lenny and he has to download Dropbox in order to keep his folder, synced up. Like that's awesome. That's the best way to bring Lenny into the product. I think referral programs often are a little bit lazy in that they basically use extrinsic motivation in order to bring people on. It's sort of like money. So that said, if you're going to use money, and like, so for example, driver referrals is extremely important to Uber. There's a lot of like kind of interesting tactics that you can do. In the context of a marketplace and kind of referrals, leading with the very, very biggest number possible is one of the most interesting ways to bring people in. And so the question is like, well, how do you do that? And so, you end up doing that because, first, maybe it's like, well, in order to, if you sign up as a driver, you'll get, $500, and, the inviter will also get $500. Okay, great. But what you do is you say, well, maybe there's an asterisk, which is like, well, you have to do 50 trips before you actually get off, well, first what you might do is you might say, you have to actually sign up and do a trip. And then you might test that against, well, you have to do 50 trips, right? And figure out like, where it goes. And then by the way, you might figure out, well, 50 trips actually generally leads to X dollars of revenue. And so maybe you could say $500 plus some kind of a guarantee, so that it's going to generate $1,000 of revenue. And so actually the guarantee is for $1,500 and like that becomes another interesting thing. And so there's all these kinds of like structures that you're able to create. Another structure that Uber tried over the years was, well, if you refer, one person, you get, $200. If you refer 5 people, you get, $300. And what happens is most people don't get up to that level. However, but you have like the big headline number to draw people in. And so anyway, there's a lot of like interesting things that you can do with the structure of all these incentives in order to make it really pop, when you're marketing them in emails or in in-app messaging and like that kind of thing. And then there's a million things we could talk about, like actually optimizing the actual screens and, the invite codes, like putting your name in the invite code actually performs better and, all the tracking and like all that other stuff, but I'll leave that for another time.
So bad news, we're out of time. We have 20 more questions and we could probably keep going for another couple hours, but unfortunately we got to wrap it up. Do you have a good time, Andrew?
No, this is great. This is awesome. And yeah, I mean, if you tweet at us on Twitter, maybe we'll have time later today to answer a couple of them.
That's a great point.
Do that.
I learned a lot. Hopefully everyone else learned as much as I did. Thanks for joining us, everybody. We're going to just sign off at this point. Thank you. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for doing this.
All right. Good to see you, Slushers. Later.
Bye, Slushers, Slushies.